The Disciples of the Dove, a sequel to The Sacrament of Flesh, about Sebastian Dove's Apostles, Part 1. The Gallery of Mirrors, 3 years after Sebastian Dove's death. Alina Cross stood in the Berlin Gallery, where it had all begun for her. Not the beginning of Sebastian's crimes. She'd been 14 when those started, too young to know his name. But the beginning of her obsession. The exhibition was called Martyr Monster, the legacy of Sebastian Dove. Photographs only, the actual sculptures had been destroyed by court order, melted down or burned or buried in unmarked locations like nuclear waste. But the photographs remained legal, protected as documentation, as evidence, as art history. Alina moved through the space slowly, reverently. Station of the Cross, number 5 glowed on the wall in high resolution, the man on the Charles Bridge, arms spread, morning light turning the resin-filled veins to amber. She'd stared at this image for hundreds of hours. She'd traced the lines of it in her notebooks. She tried to understand the geometry of grace that Sebastian had discovered. Around her, the opening night crowd murmured. Art critics in black, academics with wine glasses, tourists who'd come for the transgression, the frisson of standing close to documented murder and calling it culture. Remarkable, isn't it? A voice beside her. Male, late 30s, expensive suit. The way he transformed horror into transcendence. Alina turned. The man had the look of someone who collected rare things, watches, wines, experiences that came with a high price and a low body count. He didn't transform anything, Alina said quietly. He just dressed murder up in theological language and called it meaning. The man's smile didn't waver. But isn't that what all religion does? Dress up the fundamental violence of existence in pretty metaphors. That's what Sebastian believed, Alina agreed. He was wrong. She moved away before the man could respond, deeper into the gallery, toward the piece she'd come to see. The Last Supper photographs filled an entire wall, 12 panels, each disciple captured in excruciating detail. The central panel, the Christ position, showed Sebastian himself, still breathing when police had found him. Eyes open, blue as forgiveness, empty as churches at midnight. Alina stood before it for a long time, long enough that the crowd thinned, the gallery lights dimmed in warning. The security guard coughed meaningfully. She didn't move, because she'd come to understand something in her 3 years of research, her obsession, her descent into the cathedral of Sebastian's mind. She was not alone. Part 2. The Forum of the Faithful, the website was called The Dove Ascending. It lived in the dark corners of the internet, accessible only through encrypted browsers, password protected, invitation only. Alina had found it 8 months ago. Or rather, it had found her after she'd published her master's thesis on corporeal surrealism and the aesthetics of sacred violence. Someone had sent her a link, a single line of text for those who understand. The forum had 847 members. Not all were fanatics. Some were academics like herself, studying Sebastian as a cultural phenomenon. Some were true crime enthusiasts, the kind who wore t-shirts with serial killers' faces and dated them by body count. Some were artists who saw in Sebastian's work a kind of purity, a commitment to his vision that was almost admirable if you squinted hard enough and turned off most of your moral reasoning. And some, a small number, maybe 20 or 30, were true believers. They called themselves the apostles. Alina had been lurking for months, reading their posts, tracking their rhetoric. They spoke in religious language, Sebastian's language. They talked about transubstantiation and sacrifice. They analyzed his techniques with the fervor of Talmudic scholars. They shared photographs they'd managed to obtain through unclear means, crime scene images, autopsy reports, details that should have been sealed. And recently, they'd started talking about continuation. The work cannot end with the master, wrote someone with the username Doubting Thomas. Art requires disciples. Faith requires martyrs. Someone must carry the gospel forward. But who could match his vision? Replied another. Sebastian wasn't just skilled, he was chosen, touched by the divine through suffering. Then we must suffer as he suffered, wrote a third. We must descend into the same hell before we can create the same heaven. Alina read these exchanges with a mixture of fascination and dread. She'd started her research as pure academic inquiry, trying to understand how childhood trauma could create such a specific pathology, how religious abuse could be metabolized into systematic murder. But the deeper she went, the more she felt the pull of it. The seduction of meaning through horror. The promise that suffering could be made beautiful, that violence could be made sacred. She understood the appeal. That was the terrifying part. She understood why someone would want to believe Sebastian had found something true in all that blood and artistry. Part 3. The would-be Messiah, his real name was Marcus Webb, but on the forum, he called himself Peter the Rock. 26 years old, architecture student, raised Catholic, lapsed, searching for something to fill the God-shaped hole that his parents' faith had carved into him. Alina had been watching him for 3 months. His posts had a particular intensity, a building fervor. He talked about Sebastian the way medieval mystics talked about their visions, as if the murders were holy visitations, as if the sculptures were scripture written in flesh. He traveled to every site where Sebastian's works had appeared. He'd collected relics, a stone from the Charles Bridge, a splinter of wood from the Florence Piazza, dirt from the monastery where the Last Supper had been found. He was building a shrine, and more than that, he was building a plan. Alina had hacked his private messages. Not difficult for all his theological sophistication, Marcus was sloppy with digital security. She'd read his manifestos, his sketches, his careful notes on procurement and preparation. He was going to create his own sculpture, his own station of the cross. He'd chosen his victim, a priest from his childhood parish, the one who told him his doubts were sins, his questions were blasphemies. He'd rented a warehouse. He'd ordered supplies. He was going to kill someone and call it art. Alina had a choice to make. She could go to the police, show them the evidence, let them arrest Marcus before he hurt anyone. It would be the right thing, the moral thing, the only thing a decent person would do. But Alina had spent 3 years studying Sebastian Dove. She'd read every psychiatric evaluation, every interview, every piece of writing he'd left behind. And she'd come to understand something that none of the doctors or detectives had quite grasped. Sebastian's art didn't work. Not as art, not as theology, not as anything except the elaborate justification of a damaged man turning his trauma outward, making the world hurt the way he hurt. The sculptures were beautiful, yes, technically brilliant, but they were empty of the meaning Sebastian claimed for them. They were just corpses arranged prettily, just murder dressed in metaphor. And if Marcus went through with his plan, if he tried to recreate Sebastian's work, he would discover this truth. He would discover that violence produces only violence, that horror cannot be transubstantiated into grace, no matter how carefully you arrange the pieces. He would fail, not at killing, that part was easy, but at creating meaning from it, at filling the emptiness that drove him. And maybe, just maybe, that failure would save others from trying. Or maybe Alina had stared into the abyss so long it was staring back, making her rationalize inaction, making her complicit. She didn't know anymore. Part 4. The warehouse of false revelation. Alina followed Marcus to the warehouse on a Saturday night. She didn't have a plan, didn't have a weapon or a wire or backup, just a recorder in her pocket and a notebook in her bag, and 3 years of obsession leading her into the dark. The building was in an industrial district east of the city, surrounded by empty lots and shuttered factories. Light leaked from gaps in the metal walls. She could hear music, chant, medieval plain chant, the same recording Sebastian had played during his work sessions, according to the crime scene reports. The door was unlocked. Marcus was expecting someone, maybe one of the other apostles, maybe a collaborator. Alina stepped inside. The space was set up like Sebastian's monastery studio. Altar in the center, tools arranged on tables, vats of chemicals, a mirror against one wall, reflecting the scene back on itself. Marcus had recreated every detail from the photographs and police reports, but something was wrong. The altar was empty. No victim strapped down, no priest bound and waiting. Just Marcus, sitting on the floor, surrounded by sketches and diagrams, weeping. He looked up when Alina entered. His face was young, unformed, still carrying baby fat in the cheeks. Not a monster, just a boy playing at monstrosity. "You're Alina Cross," he said, not a question. "From the forum." She nodded. "I tracked your IP, saw your plans. Are you here to stop me?" His voice was hopeful, she realized. He wanted to be stopped, wanted someone to tell him no, this path leads nowhere. You don't have to become this. "I'm here to ask why," Alina said. "Why Sebastian? Why this?" Marcus gestured at the empty warehouse, the failed shrine. Because he understood. He saw through the lie of faith to the truth underneath, that we're taught to worship suffering, to see beauty in torture, to call abuse discipline and violation love. He exposed it, made it visible. "No," Alina said gently. He repeated it. He became the thing that hurt him. That's not exposure, that's transmission. But the art wasn't art. It was just elaborate murder, beautiful murder, technically impressive murder, but still murder. There's no meaning there, Marcus. No transubstantiation. Trauma echoing forward, trying to make sense of itself by making more trauma. Marcus looked at her, really looked. How do you know? Because I've been where you are. Alina sat down across from him, notebook open. I've stared at those photographs until I convinced myself they meant something. I've read his writings until his voice became my voice. I felt the pull of it, the promise that maybe, if we just commit fully enough to the horror, it will transform into something else. She took a breath. But it won't. It can't. Sebastian died empty. He said so himself. Even 13 sculptures weren't enough to fill the space inside him, because the space was shaped like love, and he kept trying to fill it with violence. Marcus was crying openly now. Then what do I do? With this, he gestured at himself, at the warehouse, at everything. With this need to make it mean something. You make it mean something different, Alina said. You break the cycle instead of continuing it. You tell the truth about what happened to you without passing it on. You create something that heals instead of something that harms. I don't know how. Neither do I, Alina admitted. But I know how not to, and so do you now. Part 5. The exhibition that never was Alina's article was published 6 months later in Art in America. It was called The Cult of Sebastian Dove, Why We Romanticize Horror and What It Costs. She detailed the forum, the apostles, the would-be disciples. She interviewed Marcus, real name changed, identity protected, about his planned sculpture and why he'd stopped. She traced the pathology of fascination, how Sebastian's combination of technical skill, theological language, and genuine childhood trauma created a perfect storm of romanticization. People wanted to believe he'd found something real, that his murders meant something. Because if they meant something, then maybe suffering always means something. Maybe trauma can be transformed. Maybe the abuse we endured or witnessed or inflicted had purpose. But it didn't. It doesn't. Trauma is just trauma. Violence is just violence. And dressing it in religious language or artistic technique doesn't change what it is. The article went viral. Not in the way Alina expected. She thought maybe it would reach academics, art critics, people already thinking about these questions. Instead, it reached the apostles. The forum erupted. Some members thanked her, said she'd helped them see clearly, helped them step back from the edge. Others called her traitor, heretic, someone who'd failed to understand the gospel. And 3 days after publication, Alina received a package. No return address. Postmarked from Vienna. Inside, a sculpture. Small, maybe 8 inches tall. A dove, fashioned from bread and wine, exactly like the ones that supposedly appeared in public squares every Easter since Sebastian's death. And a note, in handwriting that belonged to a child. The body remembers what the soul wants to forget. But sometimes, if we're lucky, the soul learns what the body always knew. You don't honor suffering by making more of it. You honor it by refusing to pass it on. Thank you for breaking the cycle. A former apostle, Alina, kept the sculpture on her desk as she worked on her book. It never molded, never crumbled, seemed preserved by something she couldn't quite name. A reminder that sometimes the best art isn't the art we make, but the art we choose not to make. The horror we refuse to call beautiful. The cycle we decline to continue. Part 6. Coda, the museum of what wasn't the exhibition, Martyr Monster, closed after 6 months. The photographs were archived. The debates moved on to newer provocations, fresher transgressions, but the forum remained. Alina still lurked there, still watched. The apostles thinned over time. Some members drifted away. Some were arrested for unrelated crimes. Some simply lost interest when the next compelling horror replaced Sebastian in the cultural consciousness. Marcus became a counselor, working with survivors of religious abuse. He never made art again, but he made space for others to speak their truth. That seemed like enough. Alina finished her book, False Prophets: How We Romanticize Violence and Why We Must Stop. It won awards. It was taught in universities. It changed nothing and everything because the impulse remained. The human need to make meaning from horror, to believe suffering is sacred, to transform pain into something transcendent. New Sebastians would emerge, new disciples. The cycle wasn't broken, just interrupted. But interruption mattered. Every person who chose not to become the next monster, every act of creation that didn't require destruction, every time someone said this far and no farther, these were small victories. Unsexy, unglamorous, not the stuff of legends or exhibitions or forums in the dark corners of the internet. Just the quiet work of refusing. On Easter Sunday, 5 years after Sebastian's death, Alina visited the cathedral where it had all begun. The dungeon was sealed now, turned into storage. The garden where a 7-year-old boy had found a dove